Here we go. Thank you for joining us today. We've got a small and excited group of people here to learn from you about all things COP and COP28. I'm just going to do a quick intro about the session and yourself, if that's okay, and then I'll give you the floor, and I think you should be able to share a screen should you need to, but let me know if you have any issues with that. So yeah, as Walid mentioned previously, this is our fourth session as part of the Starting Off in Climate Philanthropy series that we're holding in partnership with the Arab Foundations Forum. And today's session is going to be focused on a COP28 digest. Many people viewed the COP last year, COP28, as one of the most significant climate conferences since COP21 in Paris, which is where kind of we agreed, or we landed upon the Paris Agreement to keep warming well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And I think this was primarily because COP28 represented the culmination of the first ever global kind of stock take since that 2015 agreement. And today from Lama, we're going to be hearing about, why that UNFCCC process is important, even though it might seem overwhelming and kind of cumbersome, how we've progressed against the Paris Agreement to date. And Lama's going to be sharing some of her own reflections on the kind of aims and the outcomes as a result of COP28. To give a very small kind of overview of Lama, she's done amazing things and has a whole accolade of achievements, but kind of wanted to pull out two things, as you can see from her background as well. She's a professor and a program coordinator at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., in the environmental science, policy and energy departments. But the reason why we brought her in for this session is because she's been engaged with the UNFCCC climate negotiations from 2009 to 2014 as a climate policy officer, and then was back again in 2022 and 23. And she's been working with the governments in the Arab region to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, whilst following both the mitigation and adaptation tracks with Climate Action Network at an international level. So really honored to have you with us today, Lama, and the floor is yours, and we'll do about 30 minutes of hearing from you, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. And as I mentioned, if people have got questions already, then do put them into the chat box, and Rosie and I will facilitate as time goes on. But all yours, Lama, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Aditi, and thanks for this opportunity for having me. I'd also like to thank Walid for making the introductions, for making this happen. So thanks, Walid, for that too. I just want to check if I'm able to share screen. Is it? Yes, I can. Fantastic. Can you all see that?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay. Let me... All right, for one second, because it's not allowing me to move. There we go.
There you go. That's in presentation.
All right.
Perfect.
Great. I have this bar that's in the middle of the screen. Do you have that too, or do you not see this bar?
We just see the presentation format of the slide as a whole. Yeah.
Perfect. And it's just bothering me, which is fine. Thank you. Thank you once again, thanks for having me. My name is Lama Elhatow. I've been engaged in this process for a number of years. It's been fun, but it's also been very discouraging. What I'll go through right now is basically going through the expectations of COP28 and then the outcomes of what ended up happening with reflections, and a little bit of analysis on what it means. How does that translate into us moving forward when we try to look at climate ambitions and climate actions moving forward? What does that mean for us? I prefer not having a one-way sort of street when I do my presentations. I really do prefer it being interactive. So if there is something in the middle that you feel, oh wait, I want to engage in a little bit more further, please do a raise hand. Aditi, if I can ask you to see if there's any hands raised or otherwise, so that we can stop in the middle and do that. I much rather prefer that than me going through the presentation and then we have a Q&A at the end. It just gives it a much more interactive feel, and I feel like we engage a lot more with the content as opposed to having more lecture style and then Q&A. So please do stop me. Please feel free to ask questions. And with that, without further ado, I'll begin. So the topics that I'll be going through today's is basically I'll start off basically talking first on what is the UNFCCC process, how did this come about, and then the Paris Agreement, and what it entails. Like, what are the actual cornerstones of the Paris Agreement, which what we're trying to achieve, and then the outcomes of COP28. And the reason, very briefly, of why I'm also giving you an overview of the UNFCCC process and why that's important is that for a very long time, many have argued that the UNFCCC process is one that has become obsolete. And I'd like for us to explore that to see if that is in fact the case or not. So very briefly, the UNFCCC process, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, it entered into force in 1994. So we've had several decades now of going into several COPs. As you know, this is now COP28, which means we're in our 28th year of negotiating climate change. That being said, if after 28 years, one of the biggest arguments is after 28 years, we still haven't been able to reduce our global emissions and come to a point where we can actually agree collectively, then what are we doing? That's the biggest argument, is we've been doing this for 28 some years now, over 2 decades, almost 3 decades. And where have we actually gotten? Have we actually achieved much? And have we actually gotten to the point where where we are reducing our emissions and making a difference? So the question mark in this is that in 2015, we've had several pivotal COPs along the way. There was a COP in Denmark and in Copenhagen, which was a pivotal COP that we ended up looking into. That was in 2009. There was, of course, Paris in 2015, which was also a very pivotal COP as well, COP21. We've had several pivotal COPs that have come up with major agreements along the way. We've had several agreements, such as the Kyoto Protocol, which expired, gave us several mechanisms. And then the Paris Agreement is the first agreement that came into force in 2015, which encompasses all of the countries of the world, including the United States. And that is important because the previous agreement that we have for climate change, which was the Kyoto Protocol, did not include the United States. So as being one of the largest emitters, and at that time, the largest emitter of CO2 emissions, not being included in the protocol was a very big loss. So having it included in Paris was, of course, a big win in that respect. But then the question mark is then, well, how do we implement that? What do we actually do in terms of its implementation? Or is it just an agreement, a nice little pretty document that we sit by, but we don't necessarily hold anybody accountable? So what do we need to do to hold them accountable? So the UNFCCC has become this forum where all countries, big and small island states to large emitters such as China and the US, come together and every single person, every single nation has an equal single vote. I think, if anything, that is one of the biggest distinctions of why the UNFCCC is such a pivotal forum in of itself. We have other forums that do discuss climate change activities, such as the G20 summit, which talks about fossil fuel subsidies and how to make that happen. The IMF definitely talks about it as well, with various transaction costs. Major Economies Forum definitely talks about it. There are several other forums, including the CBD, for instance, Convention on Biological Diversity. There are other forums that do discuss climate action and how to make that happen. The SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, has an SDG number 13, which is solely dedicated towards climate action as well, that countries around the world need to focus on in order to implement the SDGs. But that being said, all of these are whether it be the G20, IMF, Major Economies Forum, these are all include a number of states. They don't include all of the states. The UNFCCC includes the entire world, with everyone on an equal footing. Now, why is that important? Because when you have a small island state like Tuvalu or the Maldives that are going to be completely inundated from sea level rise or eradicated because of climate disasters on an equal footing and an equal vote as a large emitter such as China or the US, then that's where the actual equality in terms of disparity comes into place when it comes to the UNFCCC being a very pivotal forum to discuss climate change issues. Now, that being said, of course, there are geopolitical groupings. There are different stances that end up happening within the UNFCCC framework, and that's why, in of itself, the UNFCCC takes so long. Again, we're 28 years into the negotiations and we still don't have proper action when it comes to climate happening is because since we do have all of the states, it's a consensus agreement where everybody needs to agree on it. And since it's a consensus agreement, getting all of the states to agree on something together means that you end up getting the least common denominator, which is mean the most watered down document that ends up happening, which is the agreement that we have had and are continuing to have. And that also comes down to, I guess, a little bit of a hint or a teaser towards the COP28 outcome, which I'll discuss later on in a few slides. But that also does indicate that the UNFCCC, because of these nuances, these are the pros and the cons that come with it. But with it, we need to understand that it is the only framework and the only forum that exists globally that puts everyone on an equal footing, big and small, powerful and not, wealthy and poor. And that is what makes it so significant.
I had a quick question on that, Lama.
Of course.
So even though everyone has a vote that is valued in the same way, kind of how much airtime do people get, right? So how much of the negotiations are led or the conversations are influenced and kind of led by the high emitting countries versus the small island states, for example?
Excellent question. And I think that that really stems down to the political grouping. So as individual nations, very few have airtime or political weight, except if you're, some of the larger players like China, for instance, or the United States. But even, for instance, Germany, which is a very big player in the political scene, doesn't have a weight as Germany. It has a weight as the EU, as the political grouping, the political bloc of the EU. Similarly, small island states, for instance, which you think individually are very, very weak when it comes to political weight, such as maybe Tuvalu or the Maldives or Fiji, put them together in the small island states, the SIDS or AOSIS, which is the Alliance of Small Island States, are a very important political bloc within the negotiations. So that being said, the political blocs that do form have a very strong weight in of themselves and how they end up negotiating. And SIDS and AOSIS are very vocal. They end up having very strong alliances with civil society, with environmental NGOs, which are also very, very vocal and do put on quite a bit of pressure on the negotiations and on the team. So that being said, there is weight that comes with some of these quote unquote smaller players you think traditionally, but by grouping them together in these political blocs, they become very, very influential. So they do get airtime, they do have weight, they do have significance in the negotiations quite a bit. This last year, Barbados, which is again a small island state, in political settings usually doesn't have much weight, in the climate negotiations is always the leading vocal player, and Mia Mottley, the PM, Prime Minister, for instance, of Barbados, is always extremely vocal, talking about, because at the end of the day, it's their existential livelihoods. It's an existential threat for them to actually survive or not. So they would need to be very vocal. With that, if we have any more questions, please do. I love that you came in. If we have any others, we can also discuss that. With that, I'll move on. So in that, I think one of the quotes that I really think is great was by the previous UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, when he says that let not the perfect be the enemy of the good. In that, I honestly believe, and I do believe this, is that just because we're not getting everything that we particularly want, and when it comes to climate ambitions and facing it, we need to focus on moving forward, even if they're small, tiny, bite-sized trajectories with the COP process, so be it, but we need to move forward. So that I think is very significant. Now let's take a look at the Paris Agreement. So the Paris Agreement, in a nutshell, has what we do need to keep the 1.5 alive. So 1.5 degrees is the target that was put in, forgive me, I'm getting a call, I'm going to reject that. Do you still see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things that we do see in 1.5 degrees is that it's imperative in keeping a threshold target for what we need to limit global warming and global temperature increases. And why 1.5? 1.5 was dictated by the science, by IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a group of over 1,000 scientists from around the world that have come together, one of the most reputable bodies of science when it comes to climate change, have dictated that 1.5 is the level by which it's the tipping point, by which that if we exceed, then the damages to our planet in terms of natural disasters are irreversible. So that's why 1.5 it's what we refer to as the tipping point. So keeping our CO2 emissions and keeping our warming below from 1.5 is very, very important. Keeping that 1.5 degrees Celsius target alive is very significant. In it, also, there are several other cornerstones to the Paris Agreement, which are important, which are ensuring that the NDCs, or the nationally determined contributions by countries, are also pledged. Now, the NDCs are very simply each country, in order to keep 1.5 alive, what each country needed to do is every country needs to go back home, do their homework, find out how much they can actually reduce in terms of CO2 emissions, and come back and pledge those as targets within their NDCs. Their NDCs is a document, a nationally determined contribution that is submitted to the UNFCCC that says, I, as the United States, can reduce my emissions by 30% CO2 by 2035. Saudi Arabia is going to come back and say, I can do 40% by 2035. EU will say, I can do 20% by 2035, and so forth and so forth. And what ends up happening is the UNFCCC takes all of these pledges and they do a calculation. They do a calculation of all of these pledges to understand have we, in all of these targets, these NDC targets, have we actually been able to meet 1.5 or not? Now, in Glasgow, which was in COP21, that was the very first stock taking in terms of calculations since the Paris Agreement in 2015, to be able to take all those NDCs together to determine whether or not the targets were sufficient to meet 1.5 or not. Can you guys guess whether it was? Anybody can give me a guess? No. Far from it. In fact, all of the NDC targets led us towards a 2.9 degree Celsius warming world, which means, I'm sorry, I have a student calling me on my Teams. I'm trying to, so forgive me for that.
We don't see it on our end, just so you know.
And I hope you don't hear it
No,
either.
no, we don't hear or see anything. So apart from the
thank God. That's good to hear. So basically, in Glasgow, when the calculations came about that it was a 2.9 degrees Celsius warming world from all these NDC targets, they decided, okay, everybody, go home, do your homework, go back to your countries and decide and how to increase your climate ambition even further, and come back in the following year and give us your updated NDCs so that we can meet the 1.5 degree target. So everybody did that. They said, okay, we're going to go home. We're going to come back in Sharm el-Sheikh the following year in COP27. We're going to give us our updated NDCs. What happened in 2022 that potentially hindered countries from doing that? Any guesses?
COVID.
Rosine, I didn't hear exactly what that was.
I was saying, is it COVID?
COVID was 2021, but good guess. We're coming out of COVID. It's an economic recession. Absolutely, definitely a factor. And countries are like, wait, what? We're supposed to update our NDCs when we're coming out of COVID from an economic recession? This is problematic from us. Absolutely. But there's also one very big thing that happened in 2022 as well that's hindered countries from coming back with an updated NDC.
It's the
Can anyone guess?
The war in Ukraine.
Yes. Fantastic, Anna. The war by Russia on Ukraine pretty much put a halt in most countries coming back to the table with updated NDCs. Anna, can you tell me why that would be a problem?
So Russia is a big supplier of fossil fuels, and it basically meant that, well, at least Europe had to suddenly look for other sources of energy, and yeah, that's kind of what happened.
Exactly. 100%. You're on the mark. That was the biggest problem. Russia and Ukraine, additionally, are also one of the largest suppliers of natural gas that basically warm Europe, and with the pipeline that gets transported. So suddenly Europe is in a bottleneck and says, okay, wait a minute, we're not getting natural gas. We're not getting what we need in order to supply ourselves. What are we going to do? So suddenly you have countries like Germany firing up their coal fire plants again after they had promised to completely phase out coal altogether 2 years earlier. You have countries like Norway that are saying, wait, we need to start importing oil and gas. We need to start doing a lot. So a lot of what Europe's ambitions and a lot of these other countries are stating that they were going to do in terms of reducing fossil fuel dependency are suddenly in a phase of, well, wait, we need to warm our citizens and our people for the winter, and we're no longer getting this natural gas that's coming from Russia, so we need to find other alternatives, and hence firing up coal power plants, oil and gas dependency on other OPEC countries, and so forth. So a lot of the countries, basically right before Sharm el-Sheikh, where they were intended to update their NDCs and put higher climate ambitious targets, out of the 200 and something countries that were supposed to supply updated NDCs, we ended up having 8. 8 countries submitted updated NDCs before Sharm el-Sheikh, which is of course incredibly problematic. And they moved into Sharm el-Sheikh and said, okay, we cannot do an additional calculation this year because obviously we definitely haven't reached 1.5 with these 8 updated NDCs. We're not going anywhere with it. So everybody go back home, do your homework once again, and come back in Dubai and let us have updated NDCs. But for real this time, guys, please, for real this time, come back with updated NDCs in Dubai. And they did that. They did that. This year they came around and the world came back with updated NDCs because this year was a pivotal year, which was the global stock take. And I'll get into that a little bit more. But the reason I'm giving you this long history is that this year in Dubai, one of the biggest things that was intended to come out was understanding the global stock take and what did the global stock take actually achieve in terms of reaching a 1.5 target. Very briefly, some other key ambitions of the Paris Agreement was delivering the climate finance. So there was a pledged 100 billion climate finance that was intended every year from Paris moving forward. And one thing that you also should know is that since Paris has since that pledge from 2015, there hasn't been a single year where the 100 billion has actually been fully dispersed. The maximum has been around 70 billion or 75 billion. I think the numbers are distorted based on how you account them. The World Bank numbers distort from IMF, so it depends on how you count them. But I would say that the maximum the agreed upon is that it has not exceeded 80 billion ever since that pledge has been made in 2015. Which is very problematic, which means that developing countries are not getting significant climate finance, which means that the world is not getting proper support in terms of being able to reduce its emissions, which means that we are in a bottleneck if we don't get the support to be able to do it. So climate finance is a big one. Of course, adaptation is a very big one as well. How do we actually find ways for the least developed countries and the developing world to also find ways to adapt to this future? And of course, phasing out of coal as a whole. These were some of the pillars of the Paris Agreement. I think we can move forward and look at them now. However, in terms of COP28.
Can I jump in with a quick question?
Please.
On the 1.5 degree target, there's a lot of debate around whether we can actually reach 1.5 and whether we now need to sort of readjust that target to be more realistic, which I've put in quotes. Is that sort of debate, that conversation making its way into this process at all? And how is that happening? And what's the sentiment around it?
Yes, very much so. I wonder if I should answer that now or we should put a pin in it because I'm about to get into something very similar on that in a second. Will you allow us to put a pin in it for about maybe 2 slides?
I'll allow it.
Thank you. Okay, then let's see precisely COP28. What is it? So very, very briefly, COP28 was in Dubai this year. There were 2 zones, blue zones and a green zone. Blue zone is where you have to have a UNFCCC badge. Green zone is where it's free access for all. And the idea behind doing this started off a couple of years ago. This whole green zone, blue zone distinction was intended to allow for more participation by various stakeholders. So that whole point was intended to be able to engage more spaces. So bringing in private sector, bringing in civil society, indigenous groups, and other persons that maybe potentially couldn't get access to UNFCCC badges for the blue zone would also be able to participate with green zone as well. The leadership team was primarily, so the COP president was Sultan Jaber, who was the president of ADNOC. ADNOC is the largest fossil fuel oil and gas company in the Emirates, in the UAE, which caused significant controversy leading up to this year at COP, obviously, because a lot of the world, I wouldn't just say civil society, but the large proportion of the world was, how can we have an oil and gas company, the CEO of an oil and gas company, chairing the climate negotiations? If anything, that's an oxymoron, but one thing is that it also alludes to the fact that his own and their own personal agenda in terms of oil and gas expansion is going to be pushed quite a bit. So there was a lot of controversy in the leadership team and in appointing Sultan Jaber as the president in of itself. There was also Mariam al-Mhiri, who's the Minister of Environment. There was Razan al-Mubarak, who's the president of IUCN, and then there's Shamal Mazrui. So these are the various leadership team personnel from the UAE COP presidency, just so that you have an idea. Now who? Now, the reason I'm putting this slide here is that participation and representation matters. Who attended COP is a very big deal. And why? So this is the question mark. So it was intended to have expected about 50,000 delegates. Now, just for reference and comparison, COP27 had about 50,000 persons present in COP27, which was pegged as the largest COP that's ever happened in the face of any COP. For reference now, just so we know, the actual persons that attended COP28 are 107,000 delegates. And these are all in the blue zone, not in the green zone. We had an additional 400,000 in the green zone. But just in the blue zone alone, you had 107,000 people attending the COP negotiations, which is massive, which has never happened in the history of time, which is an absolute explosion of COPs, if I can ever call it one. And as someone who's attended more than 10 COPs in my life, I've never been to a more intense, chaotic, and incredibly massive COP of this size. I've just maneuvering around the area. It was at the Expo as well within Dubai, which was a massive venue. But being able to maneuver and go around with this COP with this many people, for me as well, I felt, and for someone who's been around the negotiations, was, I think, very problematic. Now, the question mark in this, yes, of course.
A question on that. Like, does having that many delegates feed into the watering down version of the final agreement? Or do you think it adds more representation and diversity in voices? Or does it really depend on what the makeup of that 107,000 delegates is like? Like, would we have got a different agreement if it was 50,000 instead of 107,000?
Excellent question. And I think that makes all the difference, is that who made up the 107,000? So let's take a look at that. This year, we had over 2,500 fossil fuel lobbyists attending the negotiations, which is the largest contingency of fossil fuel lobbyists that have ever been present at any COP whatsoever. You had 51,000 delegates, 25,000 observers, media, support, secretariat, staff, and otherwise. And I think the objective of having this many people was to make sure that all stakeholders are representative. Indigenous people, vulnerable communities, civil society. That was the point, and that was the endeavor. But I think the actual of what ended up happening was very far from the point, was very far from the actual objective, is that you ended up having a very large contingency of private sector individuals from companies like Chevron and BP and Exxon and whatnot. You also had very large contingencies from fossil fuel lobbyists. There were very large contingencies that were there pushing the agenda in a certain direction that a lot of people did criticize and have reflected upon since the negotiations. So that is one thing to put in mind, is that private sector has become engaged in the negotiations quite significantly over the last couple of years. But to this degree and this amount, we've never yet seen that. And that's I mean, one could argue that that is because it was present at the UAE, which is a oil producing country. One could argue it was because Sultan Jaber is from ADNOC, and so he's bringing his entire posse of ADNOC and other friends from fossil fuel companies along. One could argue all of the above, that, you know, their friends in Saudi are also bringing the other oil producing companies like Aramco and otherwise present. You could argue all the above, that it's all theoretical. What we do know is that the representation did not meet the objective of making sure that we had indigenous communities and vulnerable persons and civil society persons present. And that is a very big problem. Were they there? Yes, absolutely. We do need to be fair. Were they there in the full representation in comparison to those fossil fuel lobbyists? Definitely not. All right. Do we have any questions before we move into this? Because now we're starting to get into a little bit more technical stuff. A little bit of the heaviness, which puts a somberness on our hearts. So we do have, now moving forward, we need to look at what were the expectations. And there were 5 main expectations that we were looking to get out of at COP28. First one, as I mentioned, was the global stocktake. And very, very briefly, I'm not going to go into this too much, but as I mentioned before, the global stocktake is exactly that. We need to decarbonize. We need to meet the 1.5 degree target. Everybody come back with your updated NDC. How are we and what are we going to do about it? That was what we needed to do. The second one is climate finance. We have 100 billion that we need to meet. Everyone, we're not meeting the 100 billion and it's very problematic. How are we going to meet this 100 billion? And we need to up the finance for climate finance to the developing world. Great. The third one is loss and damage. Now, this is a new one that emerged after Sharm el-Sheikh, after the outcomes of COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh. Is in Sharm in COP27, it was agreed upon to establish an L&D fund. And loss and damage, very briefly, is different from adaptation and mitigation in one way. In that, traditionally, the 2 tracks that have been discussed have been mitigation and adaptation. And hence the finance, for instance, the 100 billion climate finance has intended to be divided 50 billion towards mitigation and 50 billion towards adaptation. So those were the 2 major tracks that we're looking at. Mitigation, pretty much very, very simply without scientific jargon, means reducing our emissions. That's what we need to do. As countries, what do we do? What do we need to do to reduce and decarbonize and reduce our CO2 emissions? So that means investing in renewable energies, energy efficiency, making sure that we move out of fossil fuels, finding ways that we don't look at high energy intensive sectors like aviation and transportation. How do we reduce CO2 in those sectors? What do we begin to do in terms of looking at alternative fuels? So this is all mitigation, which requires, yes, of course, a lot of finance. The second one is adaptation, which is, okay, well, climate change is going to happen. Climate change will have impending impacts on vulnerable communities in the developed world, since there is very little resilience there in those countries in terms of readiness. So how do we help those countries to adapt, literally, to climate change and its impacts? Now, what you do need to understand is that climate finance, even though theoretically was intended to be 50% adaptation and 50% mitigation, it has never actually been 50-50. It's always been a very large component of 80% has gone to mitigation and 20% to adaptation. And that's for very simplistic and very financial reasons, is that a lot of the times those that are doing the financing, giving the financing, are either donor agencies, or they're multi-development MDBs, which are looking for profit. And very, very honest and very simply, mitigation is profit making. If you're investing in a solar plant, for instance, in Egypt or in Zimbabwe, that provides revenue and rate of return afterwards, since it does provide a profit. But adaptation is not a profit making, and that's the difference. In that, a lot of those who dictate the financing are those who end up directing where the financing goes, which is very problematic, because the least developed countries and the vulnerable communities are not getting the adaptation money that they need. Now back to loss and damage. So adaptation says that we.
Can I jump in on that point? Maybe want to pick up later, but does that relate to the World Bank now being in charge of the new loss and damage fund that was agreed at COP28? So just possibly one for a pin later, but do those 2 correlate at all?
They do. They do. All right, let me explain what loss and damage is for those that don't know what it is first, and then I'll explain the fund, and then it's who manages it, which is the World Bank, and we can get to that answer in 30 seconds. So loss and damage, different from adaptation and mitigation, is that mitigation, we know we're reducing emissions. Adaptation is, okay, climate change is going to happen. We need to adapt to it. So we're going to find, we need to build some kind of infrastructure, for instance, on a coastline to protect against sea level rise. We need to find salt-resistant crops or heat-resistant crops in the agricultural sector. We need to help adapt in terms of water management strategies for countries that won't end up having it. These are all adaptation mechanisms that will help countries adapt to a more resilient, to a warmer world. Now, loss and damage, basically, the difference between them is saying, okay, climate change is going to happen no matter what. And what we're beginning to see is natural disasters that are going to have irreversible losses and damages that we cannot adapt to. It's not adaptation, it's complete loss of territory, it's complete loss of land, it's complete loss of culture whatsoever. So take the example of the floods in Pakistan that ended up happening in 2022, which completely eradicated towns altogether. It destroyed infrastructure, it destroyed villages and towns completely. And there were losses, economic losses, up to 300 billion US dollars in Pakistan because of those floods. Now, those floods scientifically have now been shown to happen because of loss and that is loss and damage. That is irreversible loss. Similarly, if you think of if you think about small island states where their lands are going to be completely inundated from sea level rise, that is irreversible damage. That is a loss and a damage that you cannot come back from. In that case, we're talking about loss of territory, we're talking about loss of lands, we're loss of culture that needs to be compensated to communities and to people in order to ensure that they are also able to survive and to move on. Hence the term loss and damage. And it differs from adaptation in that in adaptation, you can find resiliency to adapt to a warming world. Loss and damage means that it will no longer, we're talking about loss of habitat, complete endangered species. We're talking about areas that will no longer exist whatsoever, and we need to compensate these communities for that complete inundation. So that's where the Loss and Damage Fund was agreed upon last year. Now, in it being agreed upon, it was one of the things that was agreed upon right before COP28 is that the Loss and Damage Fund would be managed by the World Bank, or would be housed in the World Bank for an interim period of 6 months until they figured out where it would it would be housed in the World Bank for a period of 4 years, until they ended up figuring out what would end up happening after that. If it ends up being moved to the GCF, to the Green Climate Fund, that is one thing that they can discuss, but a lot of people want it to be a standalone L&D fund by itself that goes directly towards communities. Now, the World Bank has a mandate that it has to agree upon of countries or specific priority states that end up getting L&D financing and funding within the next 6 months, which is a very challenging and daunting task because L&D requires that you set criteria for selection. Now, setting criteria for selection is very controversial and has been discussed in depth within the negotiations with very, very little agreement because of the simple fact is how do you decide? How do you decide who gets priority? Do you tell a small island state like Tuvalu that's going to be completely eradicated that they get priority, or do you tell a community in Pakistan that had just been undergone complete floods and have loss of life altogether that they get the money? That it's an incredibly daunting task, and it's one that I personally would never want to have to be on that selection committee. So that being said, making sure that the World Bank has a selection criteria and in place, and putting that in place within the next 6 months is a daunting task, but they need to do that to make sure that the L&D is rolled out very, very quickly. To your question, Rosine, about whether or not the World Bank, in terms of as an MDB, whether or not that financing can become dubious or not, I think that there has been a lot of controversy and reflections on how MDBs manage the money. And I think that yes, because MDBs traditionally, whether it be the IFC, the World Bank, EBRD, European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, and all the other MDBs, have traditionally focused on mitigation because it's profitable, because it's money making, and not on adaptation. There's been a question mark on how they function, which is why there's been a lot of discussion, particularly at COP28, on debt cancellation and debt swaps. We can talk about that more later, but debt swaps and debt cancellation is basically another term for climate finance, to be able to understand, well, instead of, a lot of these countries are being asked to, they're given loans by these MDBs to, let's say, build a solar plant. And in doing so, a natural disaster like a flood comes and completely destroys it altogether. But it's still being asked to repay that loan for that solar plant, for that mitigation finance that it got from the MDB. Is that necessarily fair in that respect? So does it go under the L&D fund in this space where it gets L&D financing, or do we talk about debt cancellation and debt swap altogether? So that's where a lot of these conversations are coming up when we talk about natural disasters, particularly in least developed countries that are undergoing these loss and damages that we're seeing much more. So Libya, for instance, was a very big one this year. If you guys remember the floods that happened in Derna, that completely eradicated the village of Derna altogether. There was loss of lives. There was economic losses, infrastructure that was completely destroyed. Until today, Libya is still attempting to emerge from what happened because of the floods that happened in Derna. This is a prime example of a country that doesn't have the resiliency, doesn't have the capacity, doesn't have the financing to be able to should they receive L&D financing in this case, or should they get debt cancellation and debt swap, since they're already a country undergoing extreme inflation and don't have the capacity to repay their loans. So again, that's an argument that's coming up, there still isn't an answer, but it is being discussed within those formats. I'll move on. The next one is adaptation. The global goal on adaptation is basically looking at how do we ensure that the financing does in fact go towards adaptation and not all of it towards mitigation. As we said, that there's an 80-20 disparity. How do we close that gap and make sure that a lot of that is going towards adaptation? And the last one is fostering the shift of financial flows from fossil fuels to renewables. So this one is a question mark in that there's a lot of what is being referred to as transitionary fuels, quote unquote. Transitionary fuels such as natural gas are being pegged in towards the whole phase down, phase out argument for fossil fuels. For the longest time, we've attempted to get fossil fuels onto the COP text with very, very little success altogether. And in it, there's been language. The language terminology is I know it sounds like it's semantics, but the language makes a very big difference. It's been in reference to phasing down versus phasing out. Now, obviously, a lot of the small island states, civil society, more ambitious community would like complete phase out of fossil fuels altogether. However, if you're talking about oil producing countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, even the United States and China are looking towards phase down. Why is that? Can anyone tell me why a phase down versus a phase out would be important in terms of that disparity between developing and developed countries versus developing or otherwise? It's economic interests, very simply. It's for their economic interests. Aditi, did I see you?
Yeah,
I did,
I
right?
was just going to say, for developing countries, kind of for their development and their kind of economic situation, they would need to rely, or would see the need to rely on fossil fuels more, because they may not have the infrastructure in place to be investing in kind of green energy and the financing that goes behind that as well.
Exactly. And that's exactly it, is that it's in terms of phase down and phase out, is that you'd be surprised that there are in fact a lot of developing countries, for instance, in Africa, that are actually calling for phase down and not phase out, even though they're the most vulnerable and would in fact be most impacted by climate change, but are calling for a phase down because, for very simple reasons, is it necessarily fair for us to ask a country like Congo to completely phase out from fossil fuels altogether when it barely has any form of energy? Much of its country is not even connected to the electricity grid, and then hence asking it to completely phase out altogether. So these are the question marks in terms of phase out versus phase down. and how that, and versus then if we look at the flip side, a country like the United States, which is continuously until today opening up coal-fired power plants in the country, and are continuing to do that. Similarly with other countries around the world, such as oil-producing countries, continuously also opening up in terms of exploration. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are ramping up their exploration for oil and gas even further. So in those contexts, yes, it absolutely is fair for us to call for a phase out for many of those countries. But is it fair for us to call for a phase out when it comes to countries that can't afford it? So this is the ethical debate between phase down, phase out, and how that manifests within negotiations. So let's see what happened. That was the expectations. Now let's look at what the outcomes were. On the loss and damage fund, from the very, very first day, what ended up happening is all of a sudden, all of the very first 2 days ends up being heads of states, they come in. The heads of states, they come in and they say these long speeches. Presidents come and they give their big sort of lovely flowery words, and very little ends up happening. But this year, something very interesting and very pivotal happened on the first day of the COP. Is that suddenly the Loss and Damage Fund received pledges from countries all over the world in the amount of $700 million US. I mean, some would argue this is a drop in the bucket of what is actually needed. We need about 400 billion when it comes to loss and damage to be actually sustainable. So 700 million from the first day is nothing, but is really nothing. But from the first day for that to happen, and you had countries like Germany, the United States pledging, you had Europe, you had Switzerland, you had all these countries pledging actual money to go into this loss and damage fund so it can be actualized, including, and for the first time ever, a country from the global south, which was the UAE. And again, you can argue on how UAE is termed, whether it be global south, developing country, or otherwise, since it is an oil-producing country and it is quite rich. But officially, it is a part of the global south. So for a global south country to put in money into a fund was a first. That's a first that has ever happened. So you could say that this is a good achievement on day one to actually have a pot of money that goes into this L&D fund from the first day. But there are very, very big question marks that we need to understand. One, there's no form of replenishment that is going to happen. Is this a one-time funding that's going to happen by these countries and that's it? We're not going to get anything else? 700 million is nothing for what some of these countries need. As I mentioned, Pakistan, in one flood incident event, lost 300 billion. So we're talking about a drop in the bucket here, literally nothing. So that's another question mark that still needs to be asked, and how is that going to be replenished and what will happen? As I mentioned, it's housed in the World Bank, so we need to see how that's going to come into effect. Now, the second, wait, I think I see questions in the chat box, is that correct?
No, no, that was just Anna had to drop off, so she was just saying.
No worries. Thank you, Anna. The global stocktake is basically the pivotal one that we talked about, is that how do we meet the 1.5 target? Now, after assessing all of the updated NDCs, there was an agreement that they basically come back that we would be heading towards a 2.8 degree warming world, which is still very, very scary. Which means that we do still need to go back everybody needs to go back home, do their homework once again, and come back by 2030, which is the COP in Brazil, for the official global stocktake that is going to figure out what do we do in terms of our post-23 NDC emissions. So that's where we are in terms of meeting the 1.5. But other agreements in terms of the global stocktake that did take place was making sure that transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems was put in as clear language in the text. Now, this is a first ever. This has been a very first in the history of time that we've ever had the mention of fossil fuels within the text, whether it be phase out, phase down, or otherwise. This is the first time we've ever had that in the text. And we don't have a phasing out. Yes, we have a transitioning away, which is you could argue, a more watered down version of phasing down. But transitioning away has appeased the oil-producing countries such as UAE and Saudi Arabia, and it has appeased the United States and China and the other countries. It definitely hasn't appeased countries that preferred for a phase out of fossil fuels altogether, such as the small island states, the civil society community, and much of Africa. But again, we're looking at a consensus agreement. And so this is the watered down version of what was agreed. In terms of climate finance, pretty much nothing was agreed in this COP, and this was moved towards next year as to COP29, as there was pretty much zero agreement that ended up coming out. And on the global goal on adaptation, there was a guide, there was something that was agreed upon in order to come up with a multi-hazard early warning system by 2027 and a guide in it for implementation by 2030. Very little was agreed in terms of the financing for adaptation, but there was a way in order to ensure implementation for adaptation does occur. So very briefly here, I don't want to go into this too much, but these are the 8 actions that were put down in the COP text in order to make sure that they try to attempt to keep 1.5 alive. One of them is the tripling of renewable energy that was agreed upon, is that they did agree that this year that we will triple renewable energy capacity by 2030, that we will phase down unabated coal and limitations to it. Now, phasing down of unabated coal, the word unabated coal introduces the term of CCS, or carbon capture and storage, because unabated basically means that we can start utilizing technologies that can take the CO2 emissions and then recharge them or store them into the ground whatsoever. We can talk about that more if we have question marks on CCS. But CCS technologies have been proven to be very, very controversial. There's no agreed upon scientific agreement by the scientific community that it has shown to be safe or effective in any way, which is what makes it very, very problematic. But yet a lot of oil producing countries are pushing for CCS technology to be utilized so that they can continue to use fossil fuels as a blank card and continue to pollute. But hey, let's just take the CO2 and stuff it in the ground afterward with CCS technologies. So unabated, definitely, when you see that term within COP text, you understand that that means CCS technologies. Accelerating efforts for net zero emissions. This is something that all the countries did agree upon. And in doing so, again, here are the technologies that were incorporated, such as carbon capture and storage. Nuclear was also put in, which was one that was very problematic for a lot of countries. That is a technology that is now officially agreed upon in the text of COP as a technology to move towards low emission technologies, which is problematic. And another one is transitionary fuels. So transitionary fuels like natural gas are also being put in the text to help move towards a lower carbon future. It's not a zero carbon future, but it's a lower carbon future. And this is where it becomes also quite problematic.
I wanted to ask for your reflection on this.
Yes.
There's so much focus on, instead of reduce, do you think it's avoidance? Right, by so much emphasis being put on alternative technologies or kind of lower emissions technologies, we're moving further and further away from the kind of elephant in the room, which is the need to really reduce the use of fossil fuels and keeping whatever's not been used in the ground.
Exactly. It's loopholes. A lot of these are strategies and loopholes to move away from actually doing the work, which is reducing fossil fuel production altogether. So a lot of these loopholes that are coming in, whether it be natural gas or CCS technologies or otherwise, are basically just a series of loopholes that are being done so that they can continue to profit off of fossil fuels altogether. So yes, absolutely. It's avoidance in doing so. And a lot of it is being fueled and charged by oil producing countries, but I can't say that the blame is strictly on them, as a lot of other developed countries, such as the United States and China and India, are also propelling towards these fossil fuel futures because that's what their countries depend on currently. And asking them to move away from it requires enormous amounts of economic investments that they're just not ready yet to do. So that is definitely where we're at. I'm going to move forward. I think I've talked about this already in terms of the technologies and methane emissions, so I won't go into too much of it. I will, one thing I will just mention very briefly at the bottom here, because I do see that we're running out of time, is the introduction of AI I thought this was very cool. Is I think for the very first year, AI is finally being put into the climate discussions as a potential solution. It can be also problematic in how it's being done because of data transparency, but I think that the fact that we're even having that conversation of AI as a climate solution is very exciting. This is a personal thing, I think, personally, but I'll get into the reflections, and I won't go into too much of this as well because we've already talked about this. The transitioning away, I think, point is a very big one for fossil fuel, for the fossil fuel industry, and I think that that is one where oil producing countries definitely have put into the text in order to make sure that they can continue to profit from it. I'll keep moving because a lot of this we've already discussed. But one thing just on the last point on this page is, in fact, the technologies. The technologies like carbon capture, CCS, like nuclear, for the very first time have been introduced into the text. And I think that we need to see that that can be quite alarming. Knowing how nuclear technology is and knowing what CCS technologies can do, this can be potentially alarming. Another point that I think we need to just understand is that when it comes to nuclear, and this is on the fourth point on the document, is that there are several countries that are leading us between the US and France and the UK to triple their nuclear power by 2050. I think that when you have countries like Japan and Germany potentially also phasing out of nuclear because of what we've seen from fallout such as Fukushima, this is very, very problematic, particularly after Chernobyl, in that if we do have, the problem isn't just in terms of fallouts and leakages, but we also need to consider the nuclear waste and the radiation. How does that potentially come in to be stored as waste deposits of the uranium? Often cases it gets deposited in developing countries in our backyards. In Egypt and in Libya, North Africa has traditionally been the dumping ground for uranium deposits, actually. So is that going to continue to be the trajectory? That's one thing we need to consider with nuclear is it isn't just a zero emission future. What does it mean in terms of its leaking, its fallout, but also in terms of the uranium deposits and the waste material? I think I will stop there. Here are a couple of reactions that we've had from people about the outcomes, and I think that some of them are interesting. We've talked about it. So for instance, like US President Al Gore was saying, the influence of petrostates in the half measures and loopholes included in the final agreement. So he's obviously very unhappy. Climate Action Network, for instance, which is one of the biggest civil society organizations in the world, has said that the resolution is marred by loopholes that offer the fossil fuel industry numerous escapes and routes for unsafe technologies. AOSIS also very unhappy. AOSIS is small island states. We've made incremental advancements over business as well as usual, and we really needed exponential step change in our actions and support. So overall, I would say that there's been mixed reviews. At the very bottom of the one, you'll see that the Sultan Jaber, the president of COP28 of the Climate Summit, has stated after COP28 ended that he will continue with his oil company's record investment in oil and gas production, despite the deal that he just made to transition away from fossil fuels. So this is just an understanding of where people stand and where the trajectory of the world is in terms of their understanding of the COP outcomes and what that means for us. What do we need to do moving forward? We have a COP next year in Azerbaijan, which is another oil producing country. So we need to see what does that mean for us, because we already did see what that meant for us in the UAE. Next year is being pegged as the finance COP, and that's going to be the biggest thing on the agenda because that wasn't discussed at all this year. And so next year, finance is the year of finance. What do we do in terms of the 100 billion? Another thing also to understand is Article 6 in the terms of carbon markets is also going to be discussed in COP29. What do we mean in terms of carbon markets and carbon credits, and how do we begin to include that in our mechanisms? COP30 in Brazil in 2025 is another big COP. Traditionally there are what we call interim COPs, where very little, they kind of go by and there are very uneventful COPs. We call them interim COPs. COP29 in Azerbaijan is what we would call an interim COP or an uneventful COP. The big COPs are the ones where you end up having, where you have big ticket items that need to be agreed upon. So This COP28 was a big ticket item one. COP30 in Brazil is also a big one, which is intended to agree, or the global stock take is intended to agree upon. A lot of these interim COPs in the middle end up getting very little agreed upon, but they're still important in pushing the pendulum just even so for a little bit. So to end this, basically the last thing I want to mention is that the reality is that most of the COPs are really neither successes or failures. We need to look at them in a much more impartial light, in that we are attempting to push the pendulum forward. They may be baby steps, but there are things that do end up getting achieved. Affecting the mood for private investors and future negotiators is important, but it is not sufficient to transform the global energy system. We need to work in parallel on the ground, grassroots, to be able to make a difference. And that's what's most significant, is the COP negotiations will only take us so far. It's up to us to push the pendulum even further domestically and globally as well. The most meaningful climate action, including carbon pricing, finance, and regulations on emissions, will not come from the international level. It's going to come from the national level. And so we need to push that pendulum domestically within our countries to be able to see how we make that action happen. And of course, the COP decision is useful, of course, because it's a text that makes us all binding onto certain commitments, but to the extent that it signals to private investors and national policymakers and facilitates national policies getting passed. And that's, again, what we need to focus on, is that a lot of these international negotiations are important, but the real work needs to happen on the grounds of grassroots, on both on the national level, but also on the community level and on the indigenous peoples level, where the most vulnerable communities get impacted the most. I think I'm going to end there. A lot of talking, and I'll open it up for any questions.
I think we're bang on time, actually. So that's been super. I mean, a whistle-stop tour, and I kind of love that you started with questioning of, whether this is the right format. And at the end, on your kind of second last slide, I was like, well, maybe it's not, but I don't know what's a better format, right? But then thinking about, well, what does COP signal to, especially, members within the Arab Foundations Forum, who are philanthropists, who are civil society members, who are academics, right? And so we're really trying to detach what we can do on a national level and an individual level and a civil society kind of membership group level, and how that feeds into the bigger COP conversations. And I was losing hope by your second last slide, but I think that last slide has really made me think, okay, like there is a role, and there are ways that we can influence and move things forward to make sure that we get as close as possible to 1.5, because that's where we need to be. But really, thank you so much for that whistle-stop tour in so much detail. I wish we could have had another 2 hours for this session, because I definitely have a lot more questions around accountability structures within all of this, and the climate finance pledges and various other things. But really appreciate you giving us your time and so much information. And if you're able to, I'd love to see that deck as well, so we can share it around with folks that weren't able to attend today, and kind of read through the links that you had on there too. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing, and thank you everyone for coming and listening and connecting with us.
Of course, it was my pleasure. And I can also put my email if you guys have any questions or anything that you ever want to get in touch with me with. Please feel free to contact me at any time. And yeah, it was a pleasure. It was great having you all, and I loved your questions. I love having that engagement. I think that's what makes it a lot more exciting. And thank you for taking the time to listen to me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lama. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.